Thank you for joining me. In this video, I'm going to discuss why it is so hard for Congress to pass a budget on time beyond the 30-second soundbite. Today's presentation, we're going to talk about fiscal budget background, some long-term landscape, some history around the federal budget process, recap the budget process steps, just a quick recap, and a glimpse into continuing resolution history. Looking at this photo, you can recognize a kitten and a puppy. It's easily recognized by anybody watching this video. It's accepted. It's accepted that looking at this, you can see a kitten and a puppy. Thinking of this in terms of where the kitten would represent the consumer and the puppy would represent the business, people can also relate to that relationship. You go to the grocery store to buy food and goods, you give money, the business, you exchange. You want to pay your cell phone bill, buy a house, buy a car, generally accepted business practices that everyone recognizes and they do. So this represents the cat dog society. So everybody watching this video is essentially part of the cat dog society and accepts the society norms of the cat dog society. Then you have a curious creature, the duck-billed platypus. It has many features of other animals around the world, but is definitely unique in itself. Found only in one place, and when first discovered, most people thought it was a hoax. This creates the platypus puzzle, which represents the United States government. The challenge is you have people from the cat dog society come work and do business in the platypus world, and they try to apply their cat dog society rules to the platypus world. Doesn't always work that way and kind of creates a lot of confusion, honestly. You want to hire someone, cat dog society, you interview a person and you get hired. Platypus world, much more complicated to get someone hired on. You want to give a financial grant to an institution, cat dog society, you find an institution and you cut them a check for some money. In the platypus world, much more complicated to get that done. And then there's a whole host of issues. So the purpose of this analogy is to show that while most members are from the cat dog society, while working for the platypus society, the government, it is often a confusing hive and web to untangle. So we're going to talk about this today in our presentation. All right, some background to take home with you about the federal government. Federal civilian employment, most federal employees are defense or postal service, right? So 508,000 people, that's what delivers your mail 6 days a week. Other big employers, Department of Veterans Affairs, Homeland Security, Justice Department, Treasury, Department of Interior. USGS sits here. USGS FTE is about 8,000. FTE, full-time equivalent, which includes all sorts of calculations to get that. Some departments are smaller: transportation, labor, HUD, education. Distribution of employees, we have 12% in Washington, D.C., 55% men, 45% women, 1/3 minority, a quarter veterans, and then 7% disabled. Looking at the makeup of the federal workforce, you can see we have kind of a pyramid here. Looking at the bottom green section, 5.6 million federal contract workers. This number is not really found anywhere in the general budget as a whole number, meaning whole federal contract workers, but has been formulated through a couple studies where they've examined money spent on contracts across the government, cross-reference against GSA and OMB contract salary rates, which comes out to about 5.6 million workers. So there's a lot of contract workers that support the federal government. Moving up in the pyramid, we got civilian 2.7, includes postal, DoD, and other federal agency workers. We'll get into a little bit later what makes other federal agencies. Orange, the uniformed services at 1.5 million, and kind of at the top here we have political appointees, 3,900. So even though there's only a handful of political appointees that are changed during an administration change, as compared to the pool of employees, there's a major change in policy and direction of the government. Okay, moving on, looking at how the 3,900 is broken out, you can see we have the political appointees, the types, the different types that there is. You can see that there are 6 different types, right? Not going to go into too much detail about the political appointees types, but most people generally are familiar with the Schedule C appointments and presidential appointments, Senate confirmation, PAS. Breaking down these numbers further, breaking down the 3,900 political appointees by the numbers, these are the numbers of the 6 different categories. Interesting to see, of the 3,900, 1,203 are those are the ones that require Senate confirmation, right? So political presidential appointee, Senate confirmation. So 1,203. At the end of January 2018, about 245 of Trump's nominees have been confirmed for key positions. 146 are waiting confirmation, and 4 have been announced but not yet fully nominated. All right, so moving forward, a snapshot on federal funding. Changes daily. Looking at the 2017 federal budget, we had $3.315 trillion in revenue compared to 3.981 trillion in spending. Right, so what does that mean? So looking at the trillion revenue here in black, we're going to go down the list here. We have taxes on citizens' cash flow, taxes on citizens' payrolls, taxes on business operations, and then borrowing, right? So the black here represents revenue. So these are the federal receipts, and then whatever we don't have, we make up in borrowing, right? So 2017, 3.315, roughly about $666 billion would make up the spending. Okay, so looking at mid-session 2008, meaning July 2008, uh, our revenue was about 41.5%, taxes on citizens' cash flow, 30.5 on citizens' payrolls, 15 on taxes on businesses, and about 13% borrowing. Why is mid 2008 so important? So September 2008, the recession really started to hit, right? So 26 months later, from mid-session 2008 to September 2010, we can see there's a significant drop in the amount of revenue, 41.5 to 26.2, 30.5 to 25.0, and 15 to 11.4. Right, so to make up what we needed for spending, we had to borrow more, 37.4%. Huge amount of borrowing, around $1.6 trillion. Interesting to know that from 1947 to 2009, revenue always went up every year, year to year nominally, always. 63 years. First time September 2010 hits, revenue decline. First time in 63 years. Huge impact. Looking at these numbers, we can see just the sheer dramatic nature of what actually was occurring as far as revenue goes. Then if we move over to September 2017, we can see our numbers as far as revenue and federal receipts kind of stabilized, roughly around where we were mid 2008, right? So in terms of numbers and revenue, we're about the same, but are we really over it? Long-term impacts on the housing and job market definitely are felt in the economy still today. So looking at federal budget shares, 1960 versus 2017, 1960 being on the left, 2017 being on the right, and our little legend here breaks down what the spending is. So 1960 is a really interesting year to look at because that's pre-Great Society, meaning pre-Medicare, pre-Medicaid, pre-Social Security expansion. All that stuff happened after 1960, so looking at the federal budget 1960 to 2017, it's a good indicator of how we're spending our money. We can see in the yellows defense, about 52%, half was going to defense. Okay, that's now down to 15%. Entitlements, entitlements being if you're eligible for the criteria to receive the payment or not was 26%, is now up to 63%. Federal net interest on borrowing, 8% compared to 7%, so not a big difference there. And then other federal agencies, non-DoD, 14% compared to 15%. It's kind of interesting. They're always saying government is growing as far as other federal agencies. Compared to 1960, where we only had 14% to 15%, not really in spending terms, haven't grown that much, but definitely in size over the years. So looking at the components of the federal budget, we have 70% growing, interest on the debt, Medicare, Medicaid, other mandatory spending, federal employment, federal pensions kind of fit in here, right? Social Security. This is what's referred to as non-discretionary funding, funding that's not really discretionary every year. And then looking down on the bottom, we have 30% and decreasing, which includes DoD, which roughly equals 15%, and all other federal agencies 15%, which is discretionary spending. So whenever you hear the president's $1 trillion budget or $1.1 trillion budget, that's what they were talking about, the discretionary spending. All right, so looking at the federal budget surplus and deficits, definitely a lot of people understand that we had a surplus late 90s, early 2000. But what exactly does that mean, having deficit? So 2000, we had $236 billion at about 4% unemployment. Right, then there was tax cuts in 2001. And then a whole bunch of stuff happened between 2001 and 2008. Post 9/11, recession happened, so we were borrowing, right? So $459 billion, had about 5.8% unemployment, right? And then between 2008 and 2010, we had the Great Recession, biggest recession since the Great Depression. Borrowing, about $1.6 trillion, rounded up. 10% unemployment, right? Huge amounts of borrowing. And then, recovering all the way up from 11 to 13 to 15, right? So as borrowing decreased, unemployment decreased as well, right? So that's just kind of a look at having a surplus, having a deficit, to where we are kind of at today. So looking at this chart, how fast can a surplus disappear? January 2001, right? We had an estimate that in 2002 we would have $313 billion, 2003 $163 billion, in the 10-year period we would have a surplus of $5.6 trillion. Right, so based on this, the President Bush, was presented data by OMB, Congressional Budget Office, and the budget committees, that this would occur. And the data was pretty consistent between the three entities. This led to the tax cut of 2001, right, so over a 10-year period, a $1.6 trillion tax cut. Left a lot of room in the budget. Then we had the economic slowdown in 2001, right, so that definitely decreased what we were going to have. And then other spending, meaning post 9/11 spending, further decrease. So from January 2001 to January 2003, estimate went from $5.6 trillion to $20 billion. It just goes to show you that all assumptions and estimates that are based on the best information, and everyone can generally agree, outside factors can change rapidly, affecting the revenue. Okay, looking at the longer-term fiscal landscape, let's look at entitlements. So growing entitlement spending, percentage of GDP, right? So on this chart here, we got 1972 to 2082. This dotted line represents kind of where we are at today. This line represents historical revenue level, percentage of GDP. Dark blue, Social Security, light purple, healthcare, and red, other entitlements. So we can see entitlement spending over the years is definitely growing. As we can see here, Social Security, a lot of people always worried about Social Security and the funding of Social Security, right? That's definitely a major concern, but looking at the dark blue, meaning Social Security compared to purple, healthcare, you can see healthcare is really the real story here, right? Medicaid, Medicare, and subsidies. And then we see entitlements. So around 2035, it comes to a point when entitlements are going to represent 100% funding of entitlements represents 100% of the historical revenue level, right? So that meaning the 15% for DoD and the 15% for all our federal agencies. That's why it's shrinking, right? Entitlement reform, that's always being thrown around, but, no one really wants to have their benefits messed with, and no one really seems to have an answer to fix it. Looking at the social insurance, meaning Social Security and Medicare's trust funds, we can see in 2016 we had a deficit in Social Security and Medicare. So starting in 2016, going to about 2035 when the trust fund is exhausted and the budget of historical revenue equals entitlement spending, we can see there's definitely some issues going on here, right? So stuff to think about. So when we talk about why can't Congress pass the budget, entitlement reform, huge part of it. All right, let's pivot a little bit. This chart, a little complicated chart, but let's walk through it real quick. So on the vertical axis, look at the share of total jobs. Before a recession, dotted line represents the end of a recession. So this is before and this is afterwards. So looking at the 1981 recession, 1990 recession, 2001 recession, and 2007 recession, we can see length of months. Sorry, forgot to mention length of months recessions before and after. We can see the last couple recessions after it was over, jobs in the market increased, right? Leading to an increase in federal revenue just because, more jobs, more taxes. 2007, 74 months afterwards, still less percentage less than amount of jobs that were in the economy at the time. So huge impact on federal revenue. Some federal budget history. Going to go over the history of the federal budget. Downs. All right. So looking at federal budget, how we got our start. 1789 to 1921, it was a lot of legislative dominance in the process. The Constitution gave Congress broad powers to tax and spend, no expressly provided role for the president in financial matters. All power rested with the House Ways and Means and Senate Finance. We actually had no appropriations committees until about right after the Civil War, 65 to 67. Removed around the Teddy time and then came back again in 1921. So largely concept of budget was imported from Europe, really not independently derived. So before 1870, we had no organized budget process. Agencies could write contracts and obligate the government to payments not approved by Congress, right? So you could make a legally binding contract for 10 years and without any cash in hand, and you would just go to Congress and ask for them to pay the bills, right? So that drove a lot of problems, and then in 1817, this led to the Anti-Deficiency Act, right? So no obligations in excess of appropriations, right? So Anti-Deficiency Act still stands today, which led to a practical effect. Agencies, had to submit budgets to Congress for approval. Still, no major president involvement at this time. 1913, Roosevelt commissioned Taft to do a study, right? Just to try to get a handle on the federal budget process. And the commission, it was noted that agencies were submitting budgets directly to Congress, right? Most wish it was still the same today. Met basic requirements, but, not a whole lot of other stuff going on. Failed to reflect full cost of long-term plans, right? So this commission, major conflict between the president and Congress at the time was not accepted. Actually didn't get passed until 1921. Woodrow Wilson passes through a wide range of legislation from the Taft Commission, greatly expanding government and set the new standard for the presidential influence on Congress. So huge change in the process. So passage of the Budget and Accounting Act, President became an agent in the congressional budget process, created OMB, used to be called BOB, Bureau Budget under the Treasury, but now it's on its own, and created the GAO. So Congress coordinates revenues and spending decisions with recommendations of the President. Uh, Agencies no longer can submit budgets directly to Congress. Appropriations committees return, right? So 1897 to 1921, we had no appropriations committees. They came back. Um, you know, really radically changed the process. So the 1921, the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921, established a cool toolkit. Essentially, has been the same. Over time, we've enacted a couple new tools, to add to the kit, but the budget that was submitted in 1923 looks the same as it does today in terms of schedules and exhibits. Each year the Green Book may change as far as the narrative, but if you go to the back and look at what's in the back of the actual budget, it's the same, right? So we sailed along from 1921 to about 1974. Congress was getting a little bit frustrated in the process, right? And in particular, Nixon was impounding funds. The Impoundment Act of 1974 radically changed the process again. Congressional Budget Office was created from here. Legislative appropriations committees went from 6 months to 9 months, and the process of reconciliation was created. Not going to go too deep in the reconciliation, but we'll highlight the importance of it later. Sailed along until about 1985, and then under Reagan we did the Balanced Budget and Emergency Act, right? So that was going okay, but wasn't really that great of a process. And then we amended it and passed the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990. Set caps. When you hear about caps, this is where caps came from. Used to have earmarks to where USGS could get $1 billion budget, and they would say $1 billion, 200 million, spend that 200 million on X amount of projects or widgets. So now they have caps. So if it's capped at $1 billion and you get your appropriation, X amount of dollars will be spent on this, X amount of dollars will be spent on that, right? So that's where caps versus earmarks came in. And then a whole host of other, controls, to spend manage on spending management. So a snapshot of the process, the truth just ahead, right? Just what everybody wants. Here's a budget process timeline, just kind of something thrown together. To fully understand this process, you need to do federal appropriations law, federal budget formulation, and federal budget execution. But looking at the timeline here, we can see the green arrow represents February 2018, where we're at right now. 2016, we had our budget, did our audits, and now, that's done. 2017, we got our budget late in the year. Now we're kind of doing audits. We should be in a 2018 budget, but we're not quite there yet. And then the 2019 budget was delivered. Usually the first February was a little late this year, and now it's in Congress's control, right? So this is just a quick down and dirty of how the process should work. Looking at the congressional timeline, between February and October, we should complete all appropriations, right? So President's budget gets delivered, goes to the appropriation committees. We have a budget resolution. If budget reconciliation kicks in, then we have that process. Authorizations and appropriations, June, sometime before September, all by September. February, March, CBO does their budget outlook and analysis, and OMB does a mid-session review in July. Looking at the calendar in a different way, we can see we have the State of the Union, Budget Committee and CBO overview. President's budget's released first Tuesday, April. House and Senate appropriation and budgets kind of review, have hearings, right? By mid-April, appropriation committee hearings, budget markup, April, May, complete budget resolution. Further in the process, more markups by the Senate and House. Pre-conference, conference just meaning the difference between the House and the Senate mark. Hopefully all done by October 1st, fully signed, 12 appropriations. Doesn't always happen. Then we have to enact CRs, continuing resolutions. Hopefully by November, December, maybe some more continuing resolutions with an omnibus. We'll talk about omnibus a little bit later in the process. So the 12 appropriation bills, subcommittees, so this is what they are, right? So not going to go over them too in depth, but the Interior, Environment, and related agencies, this is where USGS falls, right? So technically we just need this one appropriation to operate, right? But they don't always do that. They haven't done it for several years. Now whenever they do them, they kind of do them in one package, which is generally referred to as the omnibus. All right, so how is it managed? So President's budget come out. We have a budget resolution on the left side, making changes to discretionary changes, right, which requires 60 Senate votes, right? That's important. Goes to the appropriation committees, subcommittees, presidential signature, 1 to 12, or omnibus, right? All of them together, or continuing resolution. Reconciliation process created by the 1974 Act we talked about. That's where we see major changes as far as the changes in the tax, changes in entitlement, right? Interesting this about reconciliation is there's no filibuster, right? So in the regular 60 votes for the Senate for discretionary changes, you see the Senate's have filibuster where they stand and talk for long, long time and hold up the process. In reconciliation, there is no filibuster, and it only requires a simple majority, right? So that's why it's always preferred getting major stuff done. Just looking over the history here. 1981, President Reagan gets in office. 85, Reagan signs COBRA, expanding healthcare. 87, healthcare is further expanded by Reagan, this time regarding the training of health professionals, specifically nurses. 1990, read my lips, Bush. 93, Clinton takes office. 97, and then Newt Gingrich shakes hands on welfare reform. 2001-2003, President Bush Jr. signed and enacts some tax cut. 2010, the Affordable Health Care Act, commonly referred to as Obamacare, and 2018, President Trump's largest tax cuts in history. Right, so reconciliation is not an easy process to get done, but doesn't happen all the time. The Congressional Budget Decision Framework, on one side you got spending management, right? Special 1990 rules we talked about are in place as far as the caps. Non-entitlement spending for all federal agencies, DoD and non-federal agencies. Enacted appropriations within the budget caps. And then on the other side, where we have reconciliation, revenue and entitlements management. PAYGO, just meaning all actions must be revenue neutral. All right, so starting after 1990, when we enforced budget caps, let's look at how the process has really been managed. So 91 to 1998, huge economic growth during that period, right? So our objective at the time was to protect the tax and revenue baseline. Revenue entitlements, neutral, right? So we cruised along. And then in 1998, we realized we had a huge, huge amount of surplus, right? So if we can't meet the objective, what do? We redefine the objective. So we changed it from protect the tax and revenue baseline to protect Social Security and trust fund balances, right? Spend everything else, and then between 1999 and 2002, things radically changed, post 9/11. So got rid of the protect Social Security and then spend, politically controlled spending between 2003 and 2008. Further, that changed again in 2009 to 2017. Kind of went back to where we originally were, protect the tax and revenue baseline, and try to match our deficit. So hopefully that process didn't super discombobulate you, right? So next we're going to talk about everyone's favorite subject, voting, right? So DACA, illegal immigration, climate change, so many things that we disagree on, right? So the challenge is even though we can agree to disagree, is how we work together. So I'm going to show you a quick video. All right, so I do not own this video. It's Business Insider. Okay, so you can see around 1949 to 1951, we were roughly an integrated, loosely connected platypus hive here, right? So over the years, um, definitely you can see the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans, but yet we are agreeing. And then around the millennial, things changed significantly, right? So kind of recapping, you can see we were kind of integrated here with all our voting, and then by 2011, definitely two separate entities. All right, so continuing resolutions and shutdowns, right? So the last 30 minutes of talking, it's all coming to this point of what's going on. So looking at the number of CRs in a fiscal year, 0 to 21, right, do we have here on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, we have 1998 to 2018, so 20 years. 1997 was the last time all 12 appropriations were passed on time. 2001, we had 21 CRs, right? So that's a huge number. So between 1998 and 2018, the average is, somewhere between 5 and 8. Some years are fewer than others. Pivoting the data to look at it differently on the vertical axis, 1998 to 2017. Horizontal axis, 100 days, 200 days, 300 days. So colors are representing the number of CRs in a year, and then going out showing you how many days. So you can see in 2007, 2009, 2011, huge full year CRs just about, right? And then 2017 was quite a long one. Most people probably remember we didn't get allocations, didn't get a budget until May, and then June finally got our allocations, and then it was spend, spend, spend. So between 1977 and 2018, Congress passed all regular appropriations on time in only 4 years, 1977, 1989, 1995, and 1997. So looking at when Congress radically changed the process of 1974, between 1974 and 2018, 4 years, right? So between calendar 76 and 2018, numerous lapses in funding. So the government had lapses in funding before, but now they were starting to get to be a problem, right? So between 1976 and 1980, 6 lapses in funding, no furloughs were implemented. And then in 1980, Jimmy Carter asked the Attorney General for legal opinion on what exactly the federal government should do when Congress doesn't pass a budget by a timeline, right? So never ask a lawyer a question you really don't want the answer to. And he determined that in accordance with the Anti-Deficiency Act of 1870, federal agencies are prohibited from incurring pay obligations once its authorities are expended, right? So you shut down. So this is where shutdowns and continuing resolutions were created. So we've had about 10 shutdowns between 1980 and 2018. Most revolved around budget issues and debt ceilings, furloughs of non-essential personnel. Majority lasted 1 to 2 days, few lasting more than a week, and then the major ones 95 to 96, and then 2013 most significant. So FY 2001, 21 CRs, 14 in 1996. Most other years are between 5 and 8. So major shutdowns in 1995 for FY96. The first major shutdown begins. So between the 1950s and 95, the House of Representatives was always a majority of Democrats, and then it flipped, right? So Republicans being back in power, this led to a major conflict between the president and Republican-controlled House on entitlements and domestic allocations. Resulted in two shutdowns for a total of 26 days, one for 5 days and a second one to 21 days due to lack of funding. Most recently in 2013 for FY14, Congress failed to agree on any regular appropriation bills prior to the start of 2014. So between October to December, we had a 16-day shutdown. Most people probably recognize Senator Cruz led that, and that was around implementation around the Affordable Care Act, commonly referred to as Obamacare. So eventually, that led to omnibus, right? So omnibus appropriations. What are omnibus? So omnibus is a type of bill that just includes many packages of regular, smaller appropriations into a larger bill that could be passed with just one vote, right? So instead of having 12 appropriations, 12 votes in the House and Senate, and 12 bills for the president to sign, omnibus kind of become the way it is now. So in 2014 for FY 2015, had several CRs, FY15 omnibus appropriations enacted in December. 2015 for FY16, several CRs and then omnibus in December. 2016 to 2017, a little bit different in the process. We had several CRs, and then we didn't have the omnibus enacted till May. Most people didn't get their allocations to June. Now we're in 2017, 2018 for FY18. No final action yet. We're on our fifth CR. Had the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018 with a continuing resolution signed, currently in place until March 23rd. Hopefully by then we will have our appropriations. So that's just kind of a snapshot of why the Congress can't pass a budget. It's a lot of different things. Spending's a huge one. Revenue, entitlements, discretionary spending versus non-discretionary spending. Disagreements, particularly in the House of Representatives where all the budget originates. Disagreements in the Senate. What's the future going to look like? Who knows? So thank you for watching my video. Hopefully this provides a little bit of insight, but maybe get you thinking, maybe get you more involved. Thanks.